Good morning, classmates and Sir Allison. I am Miss Vergara, and together with my other groupmates, Degamo, Gaspar, Luchavez, Milo, Moscoso, Recto, Reyes, Singh, and Kilario, we are going to present our research proposal entitled The Relationship Between the Maladaptive Use of Social Media and Psychological Distress among the grade 12 students of Bernardo College school year 2020 to 2021. Now let's quickly break down the title. First, the relationship between the maladaptive use of social media and psychological distress is the main field of the study, meaning it revolves around the concept of relationship between the two variables. Next, among the grade 12 students of Bernardo College, school year 2020 to 2021, pertains to the respondents of the study on that school year. In our research title, Maladaptive Use of Social Media is our independent variable, while psychological distress is our dependent variable.
Let's proceed to the introduction. But first, we need to know what is the meaning of maladaptive use of social media and what is psychological distress. The maladaptive use of social media, or MUOSM, referred to as excessive usage of the internet associated with obsessive symptoms. This is in the reference to the report last 2019. While psychological distress is a state of emotional suffering associated with stressors and demand that are difficult to cope with in daily life. This is in the reference to the report last 2015. In our modern generation, our technology is continually evolving and make our life more easier. And also the internet has grown exponentially and has become an integral part of our life. While some of us enjoy using the social media, there is still a chance that it could lead for having a psychological distress. And the maladaptive use of social media can increase the risk of having a psychological distress. If we continue to engage ourselves in this kind of platform, the higher the chance for us getting trouble for controlling ourselves, not to turn it into an addiction. Although social media has a lot of benefit to us, if we use it in the wrong way, it can still harm our mental health. So we, the researcher or our group, want to prove that having a psychological distress, especially among senior high school students of Bernardo College, is correlated with maladaptive use of social media.
Statement of the problem. A statement of the problem used in the research work as a claim that outlined the problem addressed by a study. The statement of the problem briefly addressed the question, what is the problem that the research will address? As a researcher, social media have become popular used to seek for resources of information and have fascinated the general public to collect information. During these days, people are forced to stay at home, and the social media have connected and supported awareness updates. This certain study introduced a new function of social media as medical information platforms in the global connected world. Relying too much on social media can be harmful as may cause psychological distress. Because even though we use it for good, if we don't use in the right amount of time, it might be cause as the opposite result. The disorder defined through frequency of use and survey question, which as whether people feel unconscious because they could not keep in touch with their family and or friends without a smartphone. The study seeks to answer the following questions. Number 1, what is the level of the social media use of the respondents? Number 2, what is the level of psychological distress of respondents? Number 3, is there significant relationship between the student use of social media towards the student of level of psychological distress?
Now, we're going to talk about the objectives of the study. But first, I would like to introduce myself. I am Mary J. Chavez, one of the researchers in this study. The role of maladaptive use of social media and psychological distress has not been explored widely. The main purpose of this study is to assess the association between immoderate use of social media and unstable mental health of grade 12 students in Bernardo College. The factors that can affect the psychological health of students has been determined, and the extent, range, and time of students was examined to find out how many students undergo psychological distress due to excessive use of social media, and also to clarify the levels of distress on how inadequately students uses social media.
The following hypotheses were examined in the study. First, students who use social media excessively are more likely at risk to have psychological distress than those who have normal usage of social media. Second, there is a positive correlation between maladaptive use of social media and psychological distress.
For the scope and limitations of the study, we researchers will focus on the excessive usage of social media and its associations to the levels of psychological distress, and will also merely acknowledge the interdependence that will affect the participants' social media usage and how it is linked to psychological distress. We also selected 120 grade 12 students of Bernardo College that will act as our participants in taking considerations to the durations of the study, the nature of the research, and the current conditions regarding the COVID-19 pandemics and the new normal.
So, in our theoretical framework, it consists of three theories, such as social displacement theory, social comparison theory, and dynamic psychology theory. But first, let's talk about social displacement theory and its relation to our research. So, according to social displacement theory, the more time you spend in the world of social media, the less time you'll spend socializing with people in the real world. So, all it has to say is that the more time you spend on Twitter, Instagram, or etc., the less time you'll spend interacting with people in the real world. And Tokunaga also claims this theory correct because he states that drop in social interaction can make an individual miserable and even result in a decline in a person's own well-being. Now moving on to social comparison theory. Social comparison theory, all it states that we are comparing ourselves towards one each other, and by the means of Facebook or other social media platforms, we can compare ourselves a lot more because these days people use social media a lot. And for example, Facebook, and for Farduli and Vartanian, they state that by using in their study, they found out that body dissatisfaction was shown because they compared themselves towards celebrities or other people who have been an ideal person for them. So, let's move on to dynamic psychology theory. So, it states that psychological shocks or emotional deficiencies affect social media addiction. So, for example, if you experience trauma while you're still a child or a young age, it can result in social media addiction because you have no one to talk to and you have nowhere to go. So you'll just probably scroll down on Facebook or find something to make you happy.
So, our conceptual framework is mostly based on the Davis cognitive behavioral model of pathological internet use, wherein factors such as the internet, situational cues, psychopathology, maladaptive cognition, specific and generalized pathological internet use, social isolation, and behavioral symptoms are included. So small modifications were applied due to Theo, Lim, and Oy's research studying the model's path analysis. So the social isolation became substantial isolation. The researchers said that, quote, a higher risk of engaging in PIU could be incurred by internet users who feel substantially rather than marginally socially isolated, meaning that there is a higher risk for a participant to have a pathological internet use and or maladaptive symptoms if he or she feels that he or she is very isolated and not just a little bit isolated. Moreover, psychopathology and time spent has a direct pathway to maladaptive cognition. Social comparison is added to our conceptual framework under the maladaptive cognitions. And with that, let's classify what maladaptive cognition is. According to Davis, maladaptive cognitions are classified as cognitive biases towards the self and the world. And so, social comparison, how one views oneself in comparison to his or her peers, the psychopathology, the existing mental or behavioral disorder of the individual, and this time spent using SNS or the social networking sites are under the maladaptive cognitions. While in substantial social isolation, before, as I've mentioned, it is how lonely an individual thinks, how lonely he or she thinks he or she is. In addition to that, we added our dependent variable, the psychological distress, to our conceptual framework. The connection between our independent variable and dependent variable are supported by researchers and researchers like Kellis, McRae, and Grealish research, wherein they've shown how social media usage does have an influence on the mental health of the participants. Moreover, the World Health Organization also supported this, and they've mentioned in their 2014 report that excessive internet usage does have an implication on the mental health of individuals who do so, especially the teenagers and the young adults. And with that, let's move on to the research design that will be presented by Antoinette.
Research design. There are numbers of methods used in this research design. Research design supports us on how to come across the research result findings. The quantitative research method is used in this study to analyze the students' use of social media through mathematical modeling. By this approach, we measured and evaluated the time spent by the student of Bernardo College over the use of social media and how it could impact a person's psychological distress. This study applied descriptive research design by elucidating the interconnection between maladaptive use of social media and the psychological distress of the senior high school students. The level of social media usage was classified by the range and the time of students' uses social media, while the level of psychological distress were represented by the scale which identified the levels of distress. Correlational design. Correlational design method is utilized to assess how the excessive use of social media can raise the risk of having psychological distress by recognizing the various contributors that affects the student's social media usage and how it is related to the extent of psychological distress. Causal comparative research design. In this study, we also implemented causal comparative research design through examining the effect of a dependent cause variable, which is the maladaptive versus the healthy usage of social media on the level of the psychological distress of grade 12 Bernardo College students. By using, by using causal comparative research design, we identify the factors such as the substantial social isolation and the maladaptive conditions.
In sources of data, our primary data will be gathered from online survey and will be distributed to the given sample size of grade 12 students of Bernardo College using Google Docs. And secondary data was collected from statistics, websites, research articles, and governmental agencies.
Statistical treatment of data. The first one is Compulsive Internet Use Scale or CIUS. Helps to identify people with pathological use. Cutoff is greater than or equal to 21. Compulsive Internet Use Scale or CIUS consists of 14 items with 5-point Likert scale. 1 for strongly agree, 2 for disagree, 3 for neutral, 4 for agree, and lastly 5 for strongly agree.
Kessler Psychological Distress Scale, or also known K10, is a simple measurement of a general distress without identifying its cause. It is a screening instrument to identify people in need for the further assessment for anxiety and depression. The K10 contains 10 questions with the corresponding scale point, where 5 is equals to all time and 1 is equals to none time. The table below is shown how the K10 is being scored. The first one is low. The low is can be shown if the score is 10 to 15 and the moderate is 16 to 21 and the high is 22 to 29, and the very high or the highest score that can be scored to someone is scored to be 30 to 50, and this is how the K10 is being scored.
Lastly, Pearson's correlation. Pearson's correlation is used to measure the relationship between the dependent and independent variable, where the dependent variable is the level of psychological distress and the independent variable is the maladaptive usage of social media. Pearson's correlation is denoted by R, which is equal to the summation of x sub I minus x bar multiplied by the quantity of y sub I minus y bar, all over the square root of the summation of x sub I minus x bar quantity squared multiplied by the summation of y sub I minus y bar quantity squared, where R is the measure of the strength of a linear association between two variables. X sub I is the excessive usage of social media. X bar is the average or the mean of the excessive usage of social media. Y sub I is the level of psychological distress of a student, and Y bar is the average or the mean of the level of psychological distress of a student.
And so, this is the end of the over presentation.